Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we were, of course, talking about the question of whether or not the children, the sons of Keturah, that Abraham had through Keturah, there were several sons that he had, were required to have circumcision. And of course, and the question was, that was not debatable, but there was a machloket, a debate between Rashi and the Maimonides as to whether subsequent generations, in other words, whether the sons of Keturah required circumcision. And there seemed to be some indication, because Rashi said they didn't. It was just the sons directly who required circumcision. Maimonides, on the other hand, said all the descendants of Keturah through Abraham required circumcision. So that's kind of, we left it, and with all a little bit of support through Jethro, who was a descendant of Keturah. Remember, he was a Midianite priest, and Midian was one of the children of Keturah. So, going on. We hadn't finished all that Torah T'mimah had to say about it. Vehine Rashi besugya kan. So it says, and Rashi, indeed, Rashi, where he's commenting in his commentary in the Talmud on this particular idea. This is in Sanhedrin, chapter 50. Sorry, let's see what this is. Yes, this is page 59b, right? Okay, he says, Katav bezu halashon. He wrote, quote, Lerabot b'nei Keturah, right? Uh, so, in other words, where it says it briti, right? It says where the commandment is given to Abraham. I'm just going to the original verse, right? And this is God's commandment to Abraham, right? Okay, he says, Arel zachar shelo yimol et basar olato, right? So we said that fact that it said et basar olato, right? And then it says it briti hefar. So this it, their understanding, right? He says, let's find the place again, right? He says that it only included the children of Keturah, or tam shisha lavadim, only levadam, only those six sons, velo zaram, but not their seed. Aval Avraham, right? However, Abraham nitztaveh lechol hanoladim lo. But Abraham was commanded to circumcise any male that was born to him. And that's the end of the quote. Ve'eino mevu'ar, and he's saying, Torah T'mimah is saying, and it's not clear, kavanato, what Rashi's intention was, betosefet dvarim ela, in adding these words, right? Aval Avraham, in other words, the words Aval but Abraham. What is understanding what he says that the only ones that Abraham had to circumcise of the children of Keturah, the sons of Keturah, were those. And what does it say? But Abraham was commanded regarding all that were born to him. What was his intention? Rashi's intention in adding those words. Ulechaora, and it would appear, gam einam muvanim klal. It's hard to understand the point that he's trying to make here. V'nir'eh, and the reason perhaps is to kasher lo, that la'atzmo, that Rashi himself had a difficulty perusho. In other words, he had difficulties with his own interpretation. Shirak le'otam hashisha levad nitztava, right? That only those six sons were required to have had the mitzvah of circumcision, but not their seed. Demimai nafshach, because regardless, im heim zera Avraham, if in fact they are the seed of Abraham, lama yifteru zaram, then why would their seed also be exempt from it? Why would they be exempt from circumcision, their seed, if they themselves were the seed of Abraham? Ve'im lav, and if this is not the case, lama yitchayvu gam hem atzmam. But on the other hand, if they're not actually considered the seed of Abraham, then why be circumcised at all? Why then? Why? Lachen, and for this reason, Piresh, he explains, de be'emet einam nechshavim kivnei Avraham, that on the one hand, in fact, they are not really considered children of Abraham. Ve'ikashe lama nitchayvu heim atzmam, and if we now have the challenge, the difficulty as to why they themselves were actually required to have Brit Milah, why they had to have circumcision, Al ze amar, and it's regarding this, amar mishum de Avraham nitztaveh, right? And on this he's saying, because Abraham was commanded, bichlal, in general, lechol hanoladim lo, anyone who was born to him, bistam, regardless, v'lo mishum de nechshavim zaro mamash, but not necessarily because those 6 children were considered his seed in terms of their yichus, in terms of their genealogy. Vedok and Torah T'mimah seems happy. He's saying he's satisfied with this particular explanation. Yes. Oh, so I also have a little bit of housekeeping to do, at least in terms of stuff that I wasn't able to take care of the other day. All right. So, first of all, Sheilot Uchuvot, right? Remember, we mentioned the responsa literature, and I looked this up. It's Sha'agat Aryeh, right? That's the name of the author, is Sha'agat Aryeh. All right, so let's take a look here. That was one thing. Here, Aryeh Le ben Asher Ginsburg, or Wallerstein, this is Hebrew, right? He lived around 1695 to 1785. Also known as the Shagat Aryeh ben Asher. He was a Lithuanian rabbi and author. His most famous book, Shagat Aryeh, a collection of responsa, was first published in Frankfurt am Main in 1755 and is still frequently quoted in rabbinical debate as are many of his responses. After its publication, he became known as the Shagat Aryeh after his books. And now we have a little bit of background there. And the other thing was, remember, I wasn't able to explain this particular abbreviation, and I looked it up, Seder Olam Rabbah, right? That's a name of a group of midrashim, Seder Olam Rabbah, probably to be dealing with genealogies, okay, in terms of that, and or sort of historical notes as far as the Tanakh is concerned. Okay, so. Going on. Here we go. Lo tikra. So going on to the verse, right? Vayomer Elohim, here we are. Elohim el Avraham, and God said furthermore to Abraham, Sarai ishtecha, Sarai, your wife, that's what Teresa was called up to this point. Lo tikra, you shall not call, it's Shema Sarai, you shall not call her name Sarai, ki Sarah Shema, because in fact her name is Sarah. That's her name. So, looking at that sentence carefully, Lo tikra v'gomer, hakoreh l'Sarah Sarai. So now we have this. It says you shall not, right? So it sounds like a negative commandment. But in looking at the language carefully, our rabbis determine that one who refers to Sarah as Sarai, eino over belav, however, does not transgress a negative commandment. Even though we appear to have a negative commandment here, if you nevertheless call Sarah Sarai by Sarai, you have not transgressed that commandment. Why? The lo tikra et shema Sarai, right? Because it says, you shall not call her name Sarai. My tama, what is the reason? Lord, so in other words, what's the reason that this is not transgressing a negative commandment? Because it says, Lo tikra kativ, because it says, you shall not call her. Ledidei kamizhar. In other words, Abraham, to Abraham, he was being warned against doing this. Rahmana, the merciful one, was warning Abraham, Aval lechule alma lo, but God wasn't addressing this to everyone, just to Abraham. So that's why if someone else who isn't Abraham calls Sarah Sarai, it's not transgressing a negative commandment. It's so carefully peeling the onion, right? Nir'eh pashut, right? So it seems very clearly to medayek midalo kativ, because it doesn't say in the sentence, lo yikareh, she shall not be called. That's not what it says. Shema. It doesn't say her name shall no longer be called. Kamo dichtiv b'shem Avraham, which is written, it's written that way regarding Abraham's name. V'rakativ b'lashon nochach, right? It's only written as a second person, hamusav la'Avraham, in referring to Abraham, levado, alone. So if you look carefully, you'll see, here we go, in Genesis 17:5, it says, God says, V'haya shimcha Avraham, it says, and your name will be Abraham, and it says, Lo yikareh, it shall not be called. Let's take a look at another one. Lord Tikra Vagomer, you shall not call. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, said Rabbi Yitzchak, Shinui Hashem, that when you change the name of a person, and you may be familiar with this, that to this very day there's a tradition of when someone is very, very ill and perhaps at the point of death, but is very seriously ill, there's a tradition and a custom of changing that person's name at that time in the hopes that by changing their name, they will not have to meet the fate that right now they're facing. So here we go. So here's an origin of this custom. Shinui Hashem korea gzar dino shel adam, that changing a person's name tears up the divine decree of that individual. Okay. Dichtiv, how do we know this? Dichtiv lo tikra, because it says, you shall not call etshma, right? Etshma Sarai, ki Sarah shema, that because you shall not call her name Sarai, for in fact her name is Sarah. Uchtiv batre, and immediately afterwards, the very next verse, it says, Uveirachti ota, I shall bless her, v'gam natati mimena lecha ben, and indeed, additionally, I will give from her to you a son. Okay, just taking a look at the verse here, right? So there's the verse that says, you should not call her Sarah, right? And then it says, Uveirachti ota, see how it says immediately in the next verse, and I shall bless her. And then v'gam natati mimena lecha ben, and additionally I will give you a son through her. Okay, so that's the indication, and this kind of interpretation, where you look at the relationship of two verses to each other, right, is called a hekesh, a connection. That this is another connection between the one verse and the other verse. Okay, Ritzono lomar. And what he wants to say is, Mishum de Sarah haita akara, because we know that Sarah was barren, biteva, her very nature. In her very nature, her body itself, she was not built in a way to be able to procreate. Kemevuar sof Parshat Noach, as we see at the end of Parshat Noach, where it refers to Abraham and Sarah, and it talks about Sarah being barren there. Uma shelo heviu raya zo me Avraham. And the reason they didn't bring this proof, in other words, we know that we just read about how Abraham's name was changed, and God mentions about blessing Abraham, okay? So why didn't they bring the proof of this particular notion from that particular source? Why did they wait until this point to bring this proof that changing the name tears up the divine decree? Okay, the Gambo Ketiv Achar, because regarding him it is also written Shinu Hashem after his name is changed. Vehefreti otcha, I shall make you fruitful. It says it there. Yesh lomar. So how does one answer this? One can say, Pashut, it's straightforward, Mishum dehu lo haya akar muchlat, because even though he was barren in his relationship with Sarah, he wasn't definitely barren. He wasn't completely barren. Right? We know he wasn't. Why? Sheharei Yishmael nolad lo, right? Because Ishmael was born of him and Hagar, right? When he had relations with Hagar. So we know he wasn't barren. Kodem Shinu Hashem. And that happened before Abraham's name was changed. V'rak habracha beribui zera misara. And only this blessing of having a multitude of seed from Sarah, Haita la'achar shinui Hashem. So in other words, what God promised Abraham that his seed would be numerous, that happened after Sarah's name was changed. But the truth is, he was told that he would be fruitful prior to this, yes, but we also know that he was fruitful in the sense of having a child, having Ishmael, that is prior to his name being changed. So we know he wasn't barren. And that's why they chose this particular verse to derive this conclusion. And this is probably a good place for us to stop for today and put in the mark. And when we meet again, we'll continue with this. But I also want to give you a chance if you'd like to comment. So I'm going to stop the share. Okay. Any comments?
Yes, I do.
Yes, good, Judith.
This goes back to what you said in the beginning, but why are they even arguing about whether non-Jews need to be circumcised?
Well, it wouldn't be, well, that's the question, right? The question is, because Abraham and Keturah had children, and so those children are the seed of Abraham. The question would be, of course, whether or not then they would fall under Abraham's covenant, right, regarding circumcision. But because Keturah essentially was a concubine, so they're not, at least for Rashi, the fact that she was more of a concubine, that's why he says that only Abraham had to circumcise those 6 children, but subsequent generations didn't require it. And if I'm understanding your question correctly, Judith, but of course Maimonides says they do. Maimonides is of the opinion that the descendants of those 6 children require circumcision.
Now, Muslims circumcise?
Yes, the Muslims, we read about how Abraham circumcised Ishmael.
Did they circumcise at the age that Ishmael was?
Well, this was a conversation we had the last time we met, and Lanny said, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm pretty sure I am, that his understanding is they also get circumcised very young. Yes, according to the Bible, Ishmael was circumcised at 13 years of age. And I myself wondered about that, but Lanny said he had spoken to a Muslim, and that person said, no, that's not the case.
Yeah.
They could get circumcised young.
Over
as babies.
Over 90% of the Muslims are circumcised today.
Yeah.
So do you ask people, men, if they are circumcised when they join your congregation?
No, I don't.
Because there are people who won't do that now.
Say that again.
They consider it, yeah.
I know. Yeah. Right. I know.
What about conversos, Mordechai?
Well, that's okay. So yes,
they find out, generations later they were Jewish and come back to the faith. I mean, what happened? Do they have to be circumcised?
yes, they do. In fact, there was a wonderful member of our congregation in St. Louis who was not circumcised and he went to speak to a urologist, and he had the circumcision performed on him as an adult. That is the only case I'm aware of in my own personal career, and that is because we are fortunate in that at one point the medical profession considered circumcision to be a good practice from a health point of view. So pretty much all the men I've converted or been involved with have been circumcised to begin with. And in that case, we actually mentioned and talked about this in a previous lesson. We have something called a tipat dam, which is a relatively painless procedure. I mean, I even know where that was done on an older child, and he didn't even whimper. It's not done where it's sensitive. It's not done in a place where the penis is sensitive. It's done at the very base, and it's done with a very tiny little prick, like using the kind of
The
little,
lancet.
yeah, the lancet that they use, right, to check,
Well,
yeah, right, for diabetes. They used to do that, right? So yeah,
I
but that
heard that called hatafot dambri.
it is called Hatafat Downbreed. Indeed, it is, which is actually, it's nothing as serious as those words would apply, right? Because it sounds like, drawing a drop of the blood of the covenant. The fact of the matter is, there's no drop of blood. There's so little blood. What you have to do actually is you take a piece of gauze and after you've done this tiny little incision, and you take some gauze and you rub it there just to see a little bit of red on the gauze. That is considered sufficient.
Uh-huh.
Yes, it's not supposed to be painful.
Have you talked with people who decide not to circumcise their sons?
Okay. In general, that has not been the situation that I've had to deal with. I had to deal, though, with a wedding that I did, which involved two Jewish people. And for whatever the reason was, I don't know if the person simply volunteered it, because I don't go around asking people if they're circumcised. I don't think, it would probably not add to my popularity tremendously. But this person, for whatever the reason, told me that, right? And I was not real comfortable about it. As I said, I knew of another adult who had it performed. And at least I hope, that one of the things that we can draw from the lessons that we're reading right now is how terribly significant this particular procedure is. I will tell you now that we've actually come to the end of it right now, because of course we're not talking about Sarah's name. So we've come to at this point to, finish our discussion. So I will say that at this point, I am fairly convinced from everything that I've read about this, that in a way it's supposed to guarantee the immortality of the individual. And that in that practice of controlling that urge, right? Unfortunately, we know that there's a lot of immorality going on, okay? And that would be prohibited by the Bible. Adultery, consanguineous relationships, etc., all kinds of stuff that's going on. The idea is to basically indicate control over that part of one's anatomy. And in some ways, by doing that, I think it also, if I'm not mistaken, having read quite a bit about it, that in some ways it lessens the consequences of that kind of behavior. That is the serpent in the Garden of Eden. That is all this hypersexual behavior is actually, represented by the metaphor of the snake in the Garden of Eden, because we know how it disrupts lives, it ruins families, it just, it's not a healthy practice. But of course, in our current society, it's something that's fairly well accepted. I mean, I think some of us are old enough to have seen a change. And of course, we know that in the 60s, that was the decade of love, but it's not. It's the decade of lust. It's not love. So, if you'll allow me that comment. But I think that that's the indication that underneath it all, but beyond the actual performance of this particular commandment, is the idea that it has supposed to have a deep effect on who we are and how we behave. And of course, it all is a reflection on the question of what's our relationship to the universe? And I think in asking that question seriously, we can try to become a little less narcissistic in our behaviors and recognize, who are we in the face of this vast and complex reality in which we find ourselves. So I'll take that for today. I'll stop the recording at this point.